LEMURIA. The separation and disconnection that took place between the spirit and the will during the time of Pan led to the next two major experiences on Earth. Lemuria took the side of the will, and Atlantis took the side of the spirit, and both civilizations tried to prove that the polarity they believed in was superior. The will felt very hurt over being blamed for the problems in Pan, and so wanted to try breaking off and evolving on its own. This is not really possible, but the attempt was a necessary experience. If judgments had not been present with this experience, the will would have evolved back to the spirit and reconnected. At that time, though, Lemurians could not release their pain over what had happened. Lemuria was called the motherland because it was attuned to feelings, intuition, receptivity and responsiveness. Many of the spirits whose home planet is the Earth lived in Lemuria and evolved the will to a high degree. Because of judgments against the active or positive polarity, Lemurians looked at themselves as children. Lemuria had a lovely civilization in its heights. It was set in a subtropical garden that had no insects or reptiles. Flowers and fruits were everywhere for the picking, and no one ever had to think about what he would eat or how he would get it. The political system made sure that everyone was housed and clothed and fed and given whatever they wanted. There was so much that this was no problem. Pottery was a developed art, and so was fresco painting. The houses were compounds much like the Spanish adobes. They were plastered white with a plaster that resisted the subtropical rains. There were baskets and soft mattings to sleep on. The people learned how to move huge rocks and even do sculpture by using sound directed by the will. The spiritual teachings were given to everyone, and the understandings since lost about the will were known then and taught. Their hearts were open as far as will energy was concerned, so they were very warm, as was their climate, but they were a little possessive. This possessiveness manifested as a pride in their way of life and in their consciousness as it was developing. The people were small and brown, slender and lithe. They were happy to be recovering again and felt they could do anything they willed themselves to do. They were able to leap and soar, jump and somersault, and they could do anything in the trees and vines that they wanted to do. They were like lemurs, and so the name, but they were not lemurs. Many, however, were people that had been trapped in the monkey family in Pan. There they had learned just what monkeys do, and later had been restored to their consciousness, in part as a result of their acceptance of the state of consciousness they had inhabited in monkey forms. Many others to whom I had given human forms were there too. In Lemuria, they were then able to recover much of their lost understanding, but not all of it. They were a very high people, though, and they were very joyful and loving and accepting of everything except their own spirits, which they judged had deserted them to their earlier fate. They felt they had evolved out of their predicament in Pan without the help of their spirits, and they did not want to let their spirits come back and reap the benefits of Lemuria, after they had seemed to escape the pain of the earlier entrapment. If it could have been accepted then, Lemurians would have learned how to clear out this polarization between their wills and their spirits, and rejoined in the fullness of man's being. But it was not. Higher and higher the Lemurian culture spiraled in its evolvement, until it completely exhausted its possibilities without the Spirit's presence to give it new inspirations. The judgments were not being released about the Spirit, and in fact were being made over and over again. The Lemurians refused anything that didn't feel like their polarity. Will was being very reactive, and yet, at the same time, feeling its own potential and beauty. Lemuria was given a long time to see if it could restore the balance lost in Pangaea. In the height of Lemuria, some teachers were sent to teach about the Spirit. These teachers were met with defensiveness. The reaction of the Lemurians was that they were being unfairly attacked by these teachers, not helped. Some of these teachers then judged, when the teachings were refused, that they weren't good teachers. Some judged that they were upsetting the people and had no right to do this. There were a number of judgments made by these teachers against themselves. These were judgments made by their own spirits, telling their wills they should be doing better than they were. This undermined the will of the teachers. There were also judgments made against the Lemurians at that time, such as help isn't wanted, they are incapable of learning, etc. Together, then, the Lemurians and those who came to help them created an atmosphere of fear and non-acceptance. It was a learning situation for all concerned. The Lemurians, for the most part, feared the teachers and saw them as trying to frighten and control them. The teachers were not only trying to help the Lemurians to reconnect to their own spirits, but were also trying to show the Lemurians what their own denied and unreleased anger was drawing to them. No amount of effort, though, succeeded in getting the Lemurians to go through the process necessary to reconnect with their full spiritual presence. The refusal finally resulted in drawing to them a reflection of disconnected, angry will, which was not allowing anything of the Spirit to be present. Dinosaurs came to Lemuria. The Lemurians refused to believe that they had drawn these dinosaurs to themselves with their own consciousnesses by not recognizing and accepting their own spirits. Once again they felt victimized by a God that didn't really care or didn't have power. Some saw the teachers as ones that should share the blame here, because they claimed to have come from God to help Lemuria. Many Lemurians thought that the teachers had drawn the dinosaurs to punish and control them, and some felt that the teachers' own judgments were what had drawn the dinosaurs. All around, judgments kept the situation from being seen for what it was. This led to further misunderstandings, and great fear arose without the understanding of how to release it. Some of these teachers were then sent out into the wild as sacrifices to the dinosaurs. Undermined will kept the teachers from being able to save themselves. As a result, the teachers died a physical death and were then trapped along with those they came to help. The judgments they made about what death was like, along with their other judgments and the judgments of the Lemurians, began a pattern of persecuting and even killing those whose ideas aren't mainstream ideas. Release of the judgments can change this. Some understandings needed here are that a person needs to keep himself free to leave any situation that is not to his liking, and that unconditional acceptance of the situation and of all the participants ensures exchange without regrets. No question about it, feeling only the will energy to be acceptable was a problem for Lemuria, and when it degenerated, the Lemurians became the savages that the basic self is so often pictured to be. The spirit wasn't allowed to be present to bring the understandings needed, and I was even banished by then, as the Lemurians blamed me for their plight. Without the guidance of the spirit, the Lemurians became more and more frightened. They had no weapons or means to combat something as immense as the dinosaurs on their own. The dinosaurs destroyed all of Lemuria's beautiful vegetation, and the Lemurians were driven underground to protect themselves. By the time the Lemurians were living underground, and dinosaurs were destroying everything on the surface, the will was so undermined again that it did not have the power to combat the dinosaurs in the way the Lemurians could have if they had believed it was necessary earlier. By this time, the will was wallowing in self-pity, and there was not enough spiritual presence to lift it above this. Then the mental capabilities of Lemurians began to seriously deteriorate, until they were like the cavemen that modern science has discovered. Some, however, remained more intact than others, and they were shown the way to escape from Lemuria by me. I gave them a reed boat design that could withstand turbulent water. They built these boats and left Lemuria in search of other places to live. The Indians of the western United States and into Central and South America, and many of the Polynesians, are the descendants of the people that fled Lemuria in this way. They all have legends about this, and their legends are accurate according to what they themselves experienced. If there is disagreement among these legends, it's because the small bands of people had somewhat different experiences. But they did all escape Lemuria, and then Lemuria sank and took most of the dinosaurs with it. In its height, Lemuria brought the will very close to recovery, closer than it had been at any time since then. It was a great sadness to many that it could not be healed then. I am not saying Atlantis was not great, but Atlantis did not accept the will the way Lemuria did. The will needed to realize, however, that accepting help is sometimes necessary. Even though it has been a long time, these past experiences are not cleared yet. The understandings needed about Pangaea and Lemuria are many. Rest assured that you will feel these feelings in your own consciousness if you experience them. Seeing the understandings is only part of it, though. The feelings need to be brought forward into the spirit's consciousness as well. There are many judgments from these experiences to which you need to connect. Connecting to your own experience here will trigger the release of the feelings. Allow the feelings. Don't just judge them to be a permanent state of affairs. Don't judge them at all. The feelings you have are only the feelings that were appropriate to the situation at the time. Free the feelings, and they will give you understandings that can in turn allow release of the judgments. Here are some more of the judgments made around the Lemurian experience. God is not really a caring God. God is not really omnipotent, or he would have taken care of us. God is cruel. God is punishing us for being bad. God tolerates disobedience to a point, and then all hell breaks loose when his anger can no longer be contained. God is an angry, judgmental God. God is not fair. God does not intervene on our behalf anymore. God thinks we are not worthy. Many that went to the polarity of Atlantis made judgments against the will as Lemuria was going down. If you were there, you can find in yourself all the judgments you still hold from this experience. Atlantis. Atlantis was the next major civilization to develop on Earth, and was located on a huge continent now under the Atlantic Ocean. A popularly held image is that Atlantis was the highest civilization ever to exist on the Earth. Atlantis was a brilliant manifestation of the polarity of the spirit, and most of the people holding fond memories of Atlantis also have a strong affinity to the polarity of the spirit. The Atlantean civilization began to develop while Lemuria was still in existence, and was peopled by those that had become disenchanted with the polarization to the will in Lemuria, and by those that had had serious misgivings about free will from the beginning. The Atlanteans sought to elevate all manifestations of the spirit, and at the same time sought to control the intuitive, feeling, will polarity. The Atlantean approach to life showed this polarization in all of its aspects. While communication in Lemuria was mainly body language and telepathic communication of feelings, communication in Atlantis was quickly developed into verbally articulate expressions of complex thought patterns and visions. Many in Atlantis developed the power of their mind to the point where they could focus thoughts and visions into crystals and store them there for later representation to groups of people. Music in Atlantis consisted mainly of intricate melodic patterns woven with voices and accompanied by instruments that were also melodic. Music in Lemuria emphasized drums and rhythm. The buildings of Lemuria were earthen, while Atlanteans built refined palatial structures of highly polished stone. Frescoes, mosaics, sculptures, weavings, pottery, jewellery, and all other art and artisan contributions to everyday life were highly refined examples of visionary brilliance in Atlantia. Glassware and the carving of stones and gemstones became highly developed arts. Atlanteans felt it was important to consider, refine, and develop the expression of the creative impulse. Everything Lemurians built and created, on the other hand, expressed the spontaneity they valued so highly. Travel for Lemurians consisted of walking, running, swimming, swinging through the trees with the help of branches and vines, and leaping and soaring rather great distances at a time. Atlanteans did not consider this to be dignified enough for them. They built roads and stately vehicles, had processions, and regulated individual everyday travel so that it was orderly. Atlantis also had majestic ships which could travel on the seas and in the air. Many Atlanteans travelled rather extensively, and some had the means to own their own air and sea ships. Atlantis developed an extensive technology. Repetitious tasks and everything that seemed like drudgery to Atlanteans received help from technology. Whatever was unsuitable for Atlanteans to do and unadaptable to technology was taken care of by sub-citizens of Atlantis. Sub-citizens consisted of several groups, beings still trapped in forms that limited them. Lemurians who had moved to Atlantis to escape the dinosaurs, but who could not embrace Atlantean ideals, and later some of the strange peoples Atlanteans discovered in remote parts of the world. Some Atlanteans wanted to use these beings like slaves. Some even abused them. Some tried to totally ignore the uncomfortable reflection of imbalance with the will that these beings presented, and some wanted to help them evolve. The power source for Atlantean technology was an energy that they had learned to focus, store, and project with the help of crystals. Pollution in the forms seen today was non-existent then. Lemuria had not developed any technology, but had been able to do some amazing things by focusing energy from the will center. This focus was also what allowed them to leap and soar great distances at a time. The development of technology in Atlantis was largely a compensation for power lost by denying the will. The Atlantean point of view held that technology was an improvement on the will. Many more people at that time had a desire to provide themselves with a technological substitute for the powers of the will than had desire to understand and evolve the emotional quality of the will. At first, the will in Atlantis went along with this because experience in Lemuria seemed to be showing that the will should not try to prevail, but should only agree with the spirit and try to do what the spirit wanted done. The will is not meant to prevail over the spirit, but neither is the spirit meant to pressure, threaten, judge, or discipline the will into subservience. The will is meant to come into willing alignment with the spirit, and this process is how the will evolves itself. All the experiences of imbalance which have taken place on the earth so far, and all the emotions around them, have been necessary to bring the will and the spirit to the place of being ready and able to balance with one another freely. Earlier, in Pan, the spirit had gotten the will into more than it had been ready to handle in manifested realities. The will in Pan, feeling it had really tried to do what the spirit had wanted it to do, had not appreciated being blamed by the spirit for not already having the experience it was trying to get. The will, in reaction to the spirit it felt had blamed it, had tried to go on its own in Lemuria. The will in Lemuria was finding itself unable to succeed on its own, and the spirits, seeing it at that time, did not take responsibility for their own part in the imbalance. Instead, almost universally, the spirits decided they had to control their wills even more and not allow their wills the opportunity to get out of control, as they judged had happened in Lemuria. Since most Atlanteans saw the earlier problems of imbalance as something that could be solved if the spirit did not let the will get out of control, the spirit polarity in Atlantis began to emphasize regulation, discipline, and orderly procedure. At first, the will in Atlantis did not object to this or try to influence the spirit, because the will really did fear that it had not done well in Lemuria. The will in Atlantis was holding a large and unexpressed emotional charge around the question of what its appropriate role with the spirit was supposed to be. The spirit in Atlantis sought to educate the will at that time and thus train the will to properly serve the spirit. The will in Atlantis tried to go along with this and be obedient to the spirit. All aspects of Atlantean society reflected these attitudes towards the spirit and the will. Atlantis. Religion and education were not separate in Atlantis. Everyone in Atlantis that was capable of receiving an education received an extensive education in the temples. Teachers in Atlantis were also students in that they studied for their entire lives. Many of the realms of study that were pursued in depth in Atlantis are just beginning to receive acceptance as valid areas of study in America today, and some are not consciously remembered at all. Atlantis developed the perceptive or extrasensory powers extensively, and this study opened realms not perceived by many today. Everything Atlantis developed was inspired and guided by these expanded perceptions and the understandings received through them. Even though Atlantis had a scientific orientation, no one at that time considered these perceptions to be unscientific. The Atlanteans' ability to apply inspiration to everyday life also increased the credibility of receiving information from other realities, other kinds of beings, and even from other planets. The Atlantean civilization appeared to be fabulously successful for a long time. Everything they envisioned and decided to try worked for them. Atlanteans saw this as evidence that they had true understanding. They did not believe they were judging the will or seeing its role inaccurately, and they did not realize that they had any denials. There were some reflections of denial in Atlantis, but rather than accepting these, Atlanteans explained them away and also tried to ignore them. Atlanteans were holding beliefs and judgments about reality that they were mistaking for reality. If they had been able to see the reflections of their own denials for what they were then, these reflections could have shown them the path to balance. One reflection which Atlanteans found to be uncomfortable, difficult to accept, and therefore misunderstood, was LEMURIA. As the situation of the will's disconnection from the spirit worsened over time, many denying in LEMURIA incarnated into Atlantis, hoping that by polarizing themselves to the spirit, they could either solve or avoid the problems of the will. Those still living in LEMURIA were, by this time, becoming overwhelmed by their situation. Even though the will polarity had been worshipping the mother aspect of God and did not feel accepting of or accepted by the father aspect of God or by their own spirits, they finally called on the father aspect of God for help. By the time the Lemurians did call for help, they were so overwhelmed that they did not believe they could be helped. The opening they made by calling for help was not able to be filled with as much help as I would have liked to give, because Lemurians were calling for help and at the same time closing the opening to receive it with a strong belief that they could not and would not really be helped because the father energy was not there for them. Even though the original cause for this belief was even older, the experience in Pan had further convinced the will that it could not count on the spirit. The Lemurian experience was a reenactment of this, as the balance point had not yet been found. The extreme fear held by the will in Lemuria had made it very difficult for the needed understandings to be received. Many spirits saw the overwhelming emotion held by the will as the reason why Lemurians could not solve their problems. These spirits decided that the solution was to control the emotions of the will. This is the belief that powered the Atlantean approach. Now, if enough experience has been gained on Earth, the balance can be found. The will needs to be allowed to express all of its fear and other emotions. Then it can clearly receive the spirit's guidance. The spirit needs to accept and receive this emotional expression also, so that it knows what its own manifested part is experiencing. Total understanding and full acceptance have not been fully present in the consciousness, and so what has taken place has been necessary, and yet it was for the most part a terrible experience for the will in Pan, in Lemuria, and in Atlantis. Rather than denying the experience of the will further, there is much that can be learned about balance by studying these experiences of the past and releasing the feelings held from them. The Lemurians had developed the magnetic will energy to a place of great power. By nature, magnetic will energy is meant to attract the spirit to it. Since the will in Lemuria feared it was unaccepted by the spirit and responded by acting against it, Lemurians were unable to draw to themselves the increase in spiritual presence necessary to guide the increased magnetic energy. Instead, the Lemurians drew to themselves, without realizing how they were doing it, a manifestation of denial of the spirit. This denial took the form of dinosaurs because that form reflected every aspect of denial of spirit that was then held in their consciousness. Seeing this experience, some spirits saw that it was dangerous for the will to open space unless the spirit filled that space with light. Judging they were not allowed to fill the space, these spirits sought to control the will. Many of these spirits incarnated into Atlantis. This has to be understood individually, but some understandings can be given to help point the way. Lemurians had feared that the spirit must have turned into an unloving, insensitive, overpowering monster to have abandoned the will by breaking off from it in Pan, when the will became caught in form. Empowered by emotions still held from this overwhelming experience, the will firmly believed it was caught in a reality where the spirit wouldn't help it. Lemurians felt that the spirit had been, and still was, capable of denying the will by overpowering it and forcing realities upon it that were unpleasant and impossible for the will to handle. Many even felt that spirit was trying to kill or at least punish the will. A secret fantasy of many Lemurians was that if their situation became desperate enough, maybe the spirit would realize it needed and loved the will and would then dramatically rescue the will and heal the split. This fantasy of hope was accompanied by a counterweight of fear that the spirit would not help and would not come down into the murky realms where the will was trapped. With all of this and more in their energy fields, Lemurians cried out to me for help, and I helped them through any opening they provided for me to reach them. I sent many teachers and direct communications to try to show them how to deal with the dinosaurs and their own disconnection from the spirit. Lemurians could not receive this. I offered them another land where they could calmly heal the denials. Only a few could detach from their homeland enough to go. I offered many forms of help, but the judgments and emotional charge in Lemuria were such that the help was for the most part not received, not implemented, or not recognized. So, when I did not seem to help with divine intervention in the form that the Lemurians were seeking, they finally called on the Atlanteans. Lemurians had wanted me to do it for them. They had not been ready or able to understand the power of the will to accept or deny the presence of the spirit. They did not realize that although I could do my part, they also had responsibility to do their part. Lemurians hoped that the Atlanteans would solve their problems for them, and yet their judgments against the spirit caused them to believe that the Atlanteans would fail to give help, just as I had failed to give help in the way in which the Lemurians were willing to receive it. The spirit and the will both were holding judgments against the opposite polarity and perceiving an image of the other based on these beliefs. When the Atlanteans arrived on the scene, they were uncomfortable with the emotionality of the Lemurians. It was just what they sought to escape by incarnating in Atlantis, and yet the Atlanteans sincerely wanted to help. They decided to help Lemuria as quickly and with as much detachment as they could, and leave as soon as possible. They decided that the way to do this was to try out their newly developed crystal power by focusing it into the nesting grounds of the dinosaurs. The Lemurians felt an instinctive objection to this, which was disregarded by the Atlanteans as superstition. The will felt denied by the spirit once again, and felt it could only watch powerlessly as the cold, detached and scientific spirit dealt with the failures of the will. The Atlanteans saw the Lemurians as overwhelmed by undirected emotion that lacked the vision and detachment necessary to solve the problems. In denial of their own wills and unable to realize that the spirit was causal here, the Atlanteans also failed to understand how the undirected emotions, held outside of loving acceptance, was creating its own reflection in the dinosaurs. The focus of crystal power only temporarily set back the dinosaur population and directly resulted in volcanoes and earthquakes that in the end sank Lemuria. This is just what the intuitional will in Lemuria had feared, and was another experience that seemed to further prove the judgments against the spirit. Some Lemurians, on the other hand, did realize that because they had such magnetic willpower, they themselves had drawn exactly what they had feared. This fear, without understanding, led to a substantial increase in denial of the will and its powers, even among those that had formerly believed in the will. Many of these frightened Lemurians reincarnated into Atlantis, polarized to the spirit. The Atlanteans did not admit that they had had anything to do with the sinking of Lemuria, but they did come back to Lemuria in its last days and offer to take back to Atlantis any and all Lemurians that would agree to go. Lemurians in Atlantis received a mixed reception, and with few exceptions were treated like sub-citizens. Many Atlanteans had not wanted to take in the Lemurians in the first place, and failed to accept the validity of information that linked the sinking of Lemuria to the use of crystal power. The Atlantean experience of polarizing to the spirit, however, was necessary because the spirit did not yet at that time understand the will enough to balance with it. The will can only respond, and so it could not initiate a solution to the imbalance, but only wait for the spirit's evolvement through experience to a place of understanding. Even the beings that already realized that the spirit and the will must balance in the heart did not know at that time how it could be done. Even the ones on earth that could still hear me directly could not fully receive the necessary information at that time because they themselves were not calm enough to receive openly and fully. The understandings they did receive, though, were the understandings that they and the ones they taught were ready to receive. Understandings cannot come disconnected from experience. Understandings must come in a progression as experience creates a readiness to receive them. Many spirits had received an overload in the beginning by trying to gain understandings without the necessary experience in which to anchor them. Many of these spirits then tried to preach to their wills, telling them how they should perform in relationship to the understandings the spirit thought it had. But they were in actuality only conceived of by the spirit at that time, and had need of the will's experience in order to grow to maturity. The reaction of the will was distrust towards the spirit, because the will was feeling overwhelmed by experience that was much more complex than the spirit's concepts represented it to be, and also because the spirit was denying and maligning the will's experience that, if accepted, could have anchored the spirit's vision into reality. I did not desire my created spirits to have to learn from such hard lessons as were brought to them by the last days of Pan or Lemuria, and yet each created spirit must take responsibility for itself and for the power it has to create its own reality. The accumulating charge in the will during Lemurian times was causing many wills to feel unable to do anything. This paralysis seemed to further the Atlantean theories that the will had to be disciplined. Most Atlanteans began scheduling their lives to substitute for the loss of direction from the will. The spirit's conceptualized vision pushed on the rest of the being to act. A common judgment made then was that the will holds the spirit back, and that the lower nature should not be allowed influence, since the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. Atlantis went ahead after Lemuria sank and explored the rest of the world to see what there was. The many varied peoples and animals discovered in the world at that time both fascinated and disquieted them. The Atlanteans had chosen to focus on the positive, and so as they studied these people, they focused only on the fascination and ignored the disquietude. On the earth at that time were many scattered bands of people that had fled from the land of Pan. Since each band of people had left Pan when they had become too uncomfortable to stay, each band had a different image of the story of Pan, which was coloured by their reason for leaving, and their legends reflected their own viewpoints. Among these peoples, Atlanteans found bands of giants, bands of little people, and bands of dwarves. Some had forms that were a mixture of man and animal, such as mermaids, centaurs, and satyrs. Some of these people were highly developed, and some were deformed in ways that severely limited the ability of the consciousness to be present, or if present, to express itself. The legends, beliefs, and societal structures of these peoples reflected in their own confusions and understandings regarding their experiences on earth. In studying all these people, the Atlanteans came very close to full understanding of the history on earth up to that time. If denial had not been present, or if the Atlanteans had known at that time how to separate denial out from themselves, the understandings they received at that time from this world exploration would have allowed them to take the next step towards alignment. But denial was present, and denial was not understood. The vision of the spirit in Atlantis was to bring together, under its direction, the scattered bands and their scattered pictures of reality into a cohesive, unified whole that would aid and increase the awareness of all. These differing beings were not yet ready to align with this vision. Denial, in the form of held emotional charge, which empowered rigidly held judgments drawn from their own experiences, and the presence of denial spirits of unloving essence, which reflected and magnified the existing denial, alienated each group from everything except their own narrow viewpoint, the Atlanteans included. Atlanteans did not know how to bring this into willing alignment. Their own denials made them unable to recognize and accept the very process that would have allowed it. Even though, in scattered instances, some Atlanteans had briefly experienced the validity of right use of will, their judgments against the will at that time were so overpowering that it caused them to deny these understandings through distrust of the source. And so, once again, the will was blamed and judged as being in opposition to the spirit. Undercurrents of frustration, fear, and anger grew behind these judgments, and since the Atlanteans had left no avenue open to accept these feelings and bring them into a loving alignment, they finally concluded they had no recourse open but to overpower the will. Their own denied feelings empowered the action they took. Atlantis resorted to a demonstration of the destructive power of their great crystal. They showed pictures of this destruction to the peoples that did not want to embrace Atlantean domination, and these peoples, feeling powerless against such strong intent, gave in. Atlantis then became the undisputed ruler of the world. If the Atlanteans had been able at that time to understand the will, they would have seen that the will was not opposed to the vision itself, but to the way in which the Atlanteans were attempting to implement it. The will had wanted to have its feelings about its position accepted, and then it would have been ready to receive the spirit. The spirit was still feeling more than uncertain about wanting to have much at all to do with the will, after the overwhelming experience of entrapment and the ensuing disconnection and experience of death. The spirit did not yet have the evolvement necessary to recognize how it was causal here, and the will had to wait once again. In many ways, the peoples taken over and ruled by Atlantis were better off than they had been before the domination, except that the needs of the will were not being accepted, understood, or fulfilled. Denial of the will increased on Earth and included more people. The will now felt more overpowered by the spirit than ever before. At first, in Atlantis, the will allowed itself to be controlled and confined by the spirit, as a counterbalance to its fear that it had gotten out of control in Lemuria. During this first period in Atlantis, great brilliance was achieved in every aspect of life. Everything Atlanteans touched came to life for them. Their touch at that time was so infused with the light of the spirit that it enlivened in ways seldom experienced now on Earth. And yet most of the will in Atlantis was not being touched by the spirit at all and was hardly alive. The expansion of spirit in Atlantis was largely made possible through development of the magnetic energy of the will in Lemuria. But at that time neither the spirit nor the will really recognized this because of the denial present on both sides. Response to the denial caused the time lag and the reactionary manner in which the spirits filled the space opened by the will. In the middle period of Atlantis, the will reached the place where it could no longer quietly hold its old charge. The controls of the spirit had, in the first period of Atlantis, been felt to be a rescue from going out of control, and a rest from the exhaustion of being overwhelmed. Now, whether the will understood itself or not, it sought to move again because it is the nature of the will to move. The will could not be kept from moving as a way to balance too much unguided movement in the past. The will now began to stir as a part of the process of seeking the balance. Feelings and desires that Atlanteans thought they had disciplined, refined, and evolved out of themselves began to stir again. Many Atlanteans in this time period began to express themselves sexually more than they had been doing in the earlier period. Conflict arose again within the self concerning morals and correct spiritual approach. Disagreements between individuals increased. Some people began to express more of what they were really feeling. In others, the will began to have more influence over the way they approached their lives. Neat schedules and orderly procedures began to break down as people began to do a little more of what they felt like doing, rather than just what they had been told they were supposed to do. Many in Atlantis, who began to do what they wanted to do, made up reasons why they were supposed to do it or why they had to do it. This was a cover for opening to acceptance of their will. The lack of alignment in Atlantis between the spirit and the will made them feel that what they wanted to do was something other than what they were supposed to do. The conflict between duty and desire made room for an increase in guilt. Guilt is fear that the spirit is going to tell the will it should be feeling differently than it is. With guilt, societal dissension increased and denial of the will in Atlantis reached a new peak. The spiritual presence in Atlantis had seen that when the will had opened space in Lemuria, that space had been filled with denial of the spirit. Atlanteans deeply feared this and judged that the will's nature was to deny the spirit. They did not have understandings needed to change the reality this fearful judgment was creating. Atlanteans believed that control of the will was essential, and that if the will got out of control, it would destroy everything. They did not know that balance would increase the presence of the spirit in direction proportion to the space opened. The more the Atlanteans viewed the will as something that would deny the spirit, the more they created that reality for themselves in this way. The spirit is the causal energy. The more the spirit denied the will, the more the will was filled with denial, and then its response to the spirit could not help but contain denial. The spirit, though, due to its overwhelming initial experience of entry into earth, believed it must deny the will in order to not be denied itself. In Atlantis, this meant that the will was to move only in the ways the spirit allowed. The will then felt that only certain aspects of itself were acceptable to the spirit. The spirit confirmed this by not touching the will with its light in these areas. The will had the feelings that it had about its experience on earth, whether the spirit accepted them or not. The spirit denied these feelings because they did not feel good to the spirit. The way the spirit avoided these feelings in the will was by not allowing them to move and express. The will then could not clear these feelings out. The spirit believed that if it did not allow the will to move freely, the will could not move into the areas that did not feel good to the spirit and express them. When the will began to stir again in the middle period of Atlantis, the strongly denied Atlanteans responded with more controls, regulations, disciplines, and pressures to conform. When the will in Atlantis felt itself to be holding as much emotional charge as it could hold, it began to try to move. When the will found this movement was denied, and that it could not gain release by expressing itself directly, the physical body had to hold what the emotional body could not hold. When the physical body could no longer hold what the emotional body was not allowed to express, the physical body tried to move it in a physical way. Since the physical body was not allowed to act out the charge it was holding, illness became the only expression it had available for clearing itself. As denial of the will went on in the middle period of Atlantis, the health of Atlanteans began to break down. Instead of allowing illness to express and tell its story of imbalance so that balance could be found, an elaborate medical science was quickly developed to combat this new sabotage of the will. Surgery and drugs were the methods developed to repress symptoms. Medical treatment and treatment of insanity took a punitive and suppressing approach towards the body and the emotions. The concept of cutting out an ailing part of the body and throwing it away is not really more advanced than human sacrifice. Both of these approaches believe a part can be sacrificed for the good of the whole. In both cases, understanding can bring balance before such drastic measures are needed. If a part of the body is ailing, then something is impeding its ability to receive light. What the spirit denied in Atlantis, it did not nourish with its light. When the spirit blocked the clearance that illness could have provided, both the will and the body began to feel desperate. This desperation carried Atlantis into its third and final period. The more the spirit tried to control the will, the more terror the will felt. The will feared it could not clear itself if the spirit would not allow it, and the will could not continue feeling what it was feeling with no release. The will was feeling denied, overwhelmed, and compressed beyond its ability to accept. The will was not being allowed to vibrate itself, and vibration is life. The will felt it was now being killed by the spirit, and in truth the spirit really was doing this to its own will. The will cannot be alive unless it vibrates. When the will vibrates, it opens space. When space is opened, something has to fill it. If the spirit, which is life, does not fill the space, then denial fills the space. If the spirit conditionally fills the space, then a mixture of light and denial fills the space. Denial is nothing. When nothing fills the space closes. When this happens, the experience of the will is the experience of opening to receive nothing, or even worse, opening to receive and receiving the spirit pushing it away. The will that is open to receive light then receives nothing. Nothing has no consciousness, no light and no vibration. It is death. The will unable to move feels overwhelmed by death and becomes desperate. This is what Atlantis reflected to itself in its final period. The will has to move and the spirit has to fill the space with light. No amount of pressure or force or imposed procedure is going to fill this space in the right way. In the final period of Atlantis, the desperation of the will manifested itself any way it could. The old charge of the will was trying frantically to clear itself. The more it tried to move, the harder it was hit with the denial it was already carrying within itself. Every attempt it made to release itself that was not met by acceptance from the spirit was met with an increase in denial. Due to the denials, the will's attempts to clear were met with more controls and reprisals by those still attempting to cling to the belief that control of will was absolutely necessary. These people tried to view the action of the will as further proof that the will was denying of and in opposition to the spirit. The social manifestations of the will's desperation were many. Increased pressure on the will caused the wills in many to break through the controls of the spirit and express in a terrifying and out-of-control manner. This desperate attempt of the will to clear its old charge made the person temporarily taken over by it appear to be taken over by something or someone else. Often, the disconnection between the will and the spirit was so severe that it was as though a stranger had taken over the normally spirit-oriented personality. Many could not remember what they had done during these outbreaks. The lack of alignment between the will and the spirit was acted out on a larger scale in society. Wars broke out in outlying regions. Disorder, civil disobedience and crime increased in Atlantis itself. Many died of terminal illnesses, and many died slow, painful deaths, bit by bit, as denial increased within them. The denial of loving essence was experiencing its last stage before death. Denial in Atlantis had placed so much of its energy field outside of loving acceptance that the loving essence that was denied and thus placed outside of love could not help but become mixed up with the uncontrolled denial that is outside of love. Denial that had no loving essence then began to find a way to manifest its presence in Atlantis. The will did not want this, and when it felt itself in the presence of this denial, its terror at facing its own complete extinction caused it to leap towards the spirit and gain its attention any way it could. The will could not let go of or escape from the unloving denial it had touched, unless it could express all the emotion it felt regarding its situation. These emotions had to clear themselves so that their magnetic involvement with denial would be gone. This was not understood in Atlantis. The presence of denial that had no loving essence manifested destructively in Atlantis because this denial cannot receive light. If the light around it is increased, it will retreat from the light, but it will not open to receive it. Atlanteans saw themselves as focusing only on the positive. They believed that by focusing only on the light aspects of each and everything, darkness would be dispelled. They did not really look at the darkness they were trying to dispel with the light. Everything has to be seen and accepted for what it really is to be truly understood. Knowing what something is necessary in order to deal with it in the right way. Atlanteans did not realize that they had to separate denial that was seeking light from denial that was resisting light. They also did not realize that they couldn't simply push away denial, but instead had to know how to let go of that which was meant to retreat from increases in the light, and fill with light and embrace that which wanted to open and receive it. People in Atlantis had little or no awareness of the role played by denial. Instead of accepting and growing to understand the will's attempts to clear itself of denial it had received, many Atlanteans still attempted to deny the will further. Society enforced this viewpoint of denying the will by killing, torturing, jailing, drugging, confining to hospitals, and otherwise penalizing many dissidents in Atlantis who were trying to clear their wills. The desperate action that some wills were taking in the final period of Atlantis was seen by many spirits as further proof that drastic reprisals aimed at controlling the will really were necessary. Unloving denial also played a role here in increasing the repression in these measures and in turning a deaf ear to the viewpoint of the will. The fear of the will that its attempts to clear itself would only result in further denial of the will was manifesting itself in reality. Toward the end of Atlantis, a number of people who really were seeking balance with the Mother Energy left Atlantis and, guided by me, founded the Eastern American Indian cultures. These people did have some balancing to do, and many of them were reactionary towards technology and other aspects of Atlantean consciousness that they judged to be integral in the imbalances. In reality, none of these Atlantean manifestations were the problems so much as the consciousness which manifested them in a state of imbalance. The final reflection of these imbalances in Atlantis was the overamping of the Great Crystal. This overamping was yet another reenactment of spirit attempting to increase itself without connecting to the will's ability and desire to receive it. The Great Crystal was charged with more energy than it could hold. The discharge of this excessive energy manifested as an undirected force that did extensive damage to the earth and eventually resulted in the earthquakes that over an extended period of time sank Atlantis. The destructive energy that took this form in Atlantis was due to the presence of denial. Even as their land was sinking, many Atlanteans were still denying that there was any connection between their beliefs, the way they implemented their beliefs, and the problems manifesting in Atlantis. Instead, these Atlanteans further intensified the split between the spirit and the will by continuing to claim that their beliefs were correct and that the reason their belief system was not successful was because the will was at fault. Some of these people escaped from their sinking land and went to what had been an outlying regions of Atlantis to continue their way of life. Egypt, Basque country, Persia, and in fact almost every place that appeared to make sudden advances in their civilization did so because Atlanteans came to settle there. At that time their land was sinking. Many more people died in Atlantis as earthquakes and sinkings swept the land. The fear of the spirit that the will would deny it was also destructively manifesting into reality. The judgments made by everyone in the last days of Atlantis were against both the spirit and the will. Some leaned towards one polarity and some toward the other. Reality is that one polarity cannot be denied without denial of the other polarity taking place. These judgments are still present, and they have lessened the brilliance of present society. Nonetheless, so many Atlanteans, in spite of the experience their judgments drew, wanted to try their approach again, that present society is primarily Atlantean in outlook. Those discriminated against in present society have had for the most part a Lemurian approach, or have at least leaned to this direction. So many judgments have been made during the course of experiences on Earth, and empowered to stay present by unreleased emotions, that these judgments cannot all be listed. The main focus of the judgments cannot all be listed. The main focus of the judgments in Atlantis was that loss of control is very dangerous and that expression of the will brings chaos. This group of judgments includes: the will is by nature disobedient to the spirit and must be disciplined, controlled and repressed. The will must not be allowed to express because it is destructive. The will's contribution to creation is in conflict to the spirit's vision. The understanding received through the intuitional faculty of the will cannot be trusted. The will is responsible for death, and there is nothing the spirit can do about this except rise above it and leave it behind. The will was never meant to be a part of creation anyway. The presence of Atlantean and Lemurian consciousness on Earth today can show you the judgments still held from those times. The vast wealth of information that could be brought forward from the past also cannot be done within the limitations of a book. These stories have brought forward some of the information that needs to be enlarged upon by individual memory. The process of clearing your own will allow it to tell its story, and will also clear your receptive centres to receive the spirit's viewpoint more clearly.